Part 1. The dream that looked perfect before her name would ever appear in police reports or headlines. She was known for something very different. She was known for making people feel beautiful. Clients described her as gentle, patient, and deeply attentive. As a hairstylist, she didn't just style hair, she listened. Sitting in her chair felt therapeutic. Women opened up about relationships, stress, motherhood, and pain. And she listened with a softness that made people feel safe. That ability to connect would later become the foundation of her biggest dream, that a dream rooted in self-care, not the trendy kind you scroll past online, but something deeper, healing from burnout, emotional exhaustion, and the silent pressures women carry every day. She believed beauty started from within. And she believed that if people were taught how to care for themselves properly, they could live fuller, healthier lives. This wasn't just a business idea to her, that IT was personal. Friends say she had always been close to her mother. Not perfect, no relationship ever is, but close enough that people admired it. Her mother was present in her life, vocal about her support, and often appeared to be her biggest cheerleader. When she spoke about her plans, her mother was usually mentioned with pride when she announced she was launching a self-care program with her mother. No one questioned IT, that IT made sense, that a mother-daughter partnership. 2 generations. Wisdom and youth. Experience and passion. The kind of story people love to believe in. The program was introduced as a space for healing, empowerment, and transformation, especially for women navigating stress, trauma, and personal growth. There were plans for workshops, digital content, mentorship, and lifestyle coaching. It wasn't just about appearance. It was about wellness. Social media posts painted a picture of harmony. Smiling photos. Promotional videos filled with positive language, peace, growth, healing, alignment. They spoke about legacy, about building something meaningful together, about changing lives. The outside world, it looked like the beginning of something powerful. And for a while it really was. The early response was encouraging. People showed interest. Some signed up. Others shared the posts. Supporters praised the vision and applauded the courage it takes to build a business, especially with family. She seemed hopeful, energized, proud. Those close to her say she worked relentlessly. Late nights, long calls, planning sessions. She wanted it to succeed, not just financially, but emotionally. She wanted people to feel helped, seen, and restored. But building a business is hard. Building a business with family is harder. And slowly, almost invisibly, things began to change. At first, it wasn't obvious. Just small moments. Slight shifts in tone. Less excitement in her voice. Friends noticed she seemed more tired than usual. More stressed. When asked how the business was going, her answers became shorter. Less detailed. She'll be fine, people told themselves. Business pressure. They said, she's just adjusting. But pressure has a way of revealing cracks. Behind the curated posts and motivational messages, there were disagreements. Differences in vision. Questions about control. About money. About who made the final decisions. Things that are common in partnerships, but dangerous when trust is assumed rather than protected. People who spoke to her privately say she began to feel overwhelmed, that the dream was no longer feeling as peaceful as she had imagined, that what started as collaboration was beginning to feel heavy. Yet publicly, nothing seemed wrong. She kept showing up, kept promoting the brand, kept smiling for the camera. Because when your business is tied to your family, especially a parent, walking away isn't simple. You don't just quit a project. You risk breaking a bond, and she didn't want that. Those closest to her say she believed things would settle down. That communication would fix it. That love would override tension. After all, this was her mother, the one person she believed would never hurt her. That belief mattered, because it shaped every decision she made next. In the weeks that followed, subtle red flags appeared. She became more private, more guarded. Less active socially. Some friends noticed she stopped sharing details about the program altogether. When asked directly, she would brush it off or change the subject. There were moments when she seemed conflicted, torn between protecting the brand's image and expressing how she truly felt. She carried the weight quietly, assuming it was temporary. But sometimes, silence isn't peace. Sometimes it's survival. The self-care brand continued to exist on the surface. Posts still went up. Messages still spoke of healing and alignment. But those who knew her will say something was missing, her joy. And then suddenly, everything stopped at no post, no updates, no explanation, at first. People assumed she was taking a break, resting, recharging. After all, that was what self-care was about, right? But hours turned into days, and concern began to grow. Because the woman who had built her life around helping others feel safe had gone quiet. No one knew it yet, but the dream that looked perfect from the outside was already collapsing from within. And the story that began with healing, trust, and a shared vision between mother and daughter was about to take a turn that no one could have imagined to be by the time the truth began to surface. It would be too late to fix what had already been broken. And this was only the beginning. Behind the brand, when trust started to feel like pressure from the outside, the self-care brand still existed. The pages were live. The language was still soft and healing. The promise of peace and restoration remained. But for her, something fundamental had shifted. What once felt like a shared dream was beginning to feel like a burden. Those close to her would later say that this was the phase where she changed the most, not overnight, but gradually, in ways that were easy to miss if you weren't paying close attention. She became quieter, more careful with her words, less expressive about her goals. The excitement that once lit up her voice when she spoke about the program was gone. Instead, there was hesitation. Behind the scenes, disagreements were growing. It wasn't one dramatic argument. It was a series of unresolved tensions that kept stacking on top of each other. Decisions that should have been collaborative began to feel one-sided. Conversations that were supposed to be constructive started ending in frustration. At the center of it all were questions no family partnership ever escapes: who in control? Who owns what? Who gets the final say? For her, the business was personal. It was her vision, her passion, her name, and her reputation on the line. But involving family complicated everything. Lines blurred quickly, between mentorship and authority, between guidance and dominance. Friends say she began to feel unheard. Whenever concerns came up, they were often minimized. She was encouraged to be patient, to be understanding, to remember that family disagreements happen. And because she valued peace and deeply respected her mother, she tried to make it work. She compromised again and again. But compromise without boundaries can quietly turn into control. There were reports of financial disagreements, questions about how money was handled, about transparency, about expectations that hadn't been clearly defined at the beginning. These weren't issues she felt comfortable discussing publicly. And even privately, she spoke about them cautiously, choosing her words carefully, as if afraid of being misunderstood or worse, dismissed. Her behavior began to change in noticeable ways. She stopped sharing business updates with friends who had once been part of her support system. She withdrew from conversations she used to enjoy. Her phone calls became shorter, her replies slower. Some friends noticed she was constantly anxious. She looked stressed, one person reportedly said. "She's not herself anymore," another observed. But when asked directly, she insisted she was fine, because admitting otherwise would mean admitting that the dream wasn't working. And that's hard, especially when the world is watching. The self-care brand had attracted attention. People had invested emotionally, some financially. Expectations were high. Backing out now would raise questions she wasn't ready to answer, so she stayed. And the pressure intensified. There were moments when she reportedly expressed feeling trapped, caught between loyalty to her mother and loyalty to herself. Family dynamics have a way of reopening old wounds, and some say unresolved emotional patterns began to resurface. What was meant to be a partnership started to feel like a power struggle. And then came the isolation. She began canceling plans, declining invitations, choosing to stay home rather than socialize. Even her closest friends felt the distance growing. When they tried to check in, she reassured them. But something in her tone suggested exhaustion rather than peace. At one point, she confided in someone that the business was no longer what she imagined it would be. That statement mattered, because it was one of the few moments where the mask slipped. Still, there was no public indication that anything was wrong. The brand's messaging remained polished. Inspirational quotes continued to appear. Everything looked stable, but inside she was struggling. There were also subtle warning signs that, in hindsight, feel heavier. She reportedly became more cautious with her movements and conversations, more aware of what she said and to whom. Some noticed she avoided discussing certain topics altogether, as if she feared the consequences of speaking too openly. Fear doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it whispers. Those closest to her would later say that this was when they wished they had pushed harder, asked deeper questions, insisted on knowing more. But at the time, it was easy to assume she just needed space. After all, self-care advocates burn out, right? But burnout wasn't the real issue. The real issue was trust, and how quickly it was eroding. Tension reached a point where the business no longer felt like a safe space. What started as healing work had become emotionally draining. The same environment that was supposed to uplift her was now weighing her down, and yet she stayed connected. Why? Because walking away from a business is one thing. Walking away from your mother is another. That internal conflict kept her in place longer than she should have been. Then came a moment that would later be described as a turning point. Something happened. An argument, a decision, a realization that made her consider stepping back. Those familiar with the situation say she was beginning to rethink her involvement. Not publicly, not dramatically, but mentally. She was starting to see that not all partnerships are meant to last, no matter how close the relationship. And that realization, if acted upon, would have changed everything. But she never got the chance, because not long after, her communication slowed even more. Messages went unanswered. Calls weren't returned. The silence became noticeable not just to friends, but to people connected to the business. At first, there were excuses. She's busy. She's resting. She needs time. But deep down, something felt wrong. The woman who once poured herself into healing others had gone quiet in a way that felt unnatural. And as concern turned into unease, the truth was already moving closer, unseen, unstoppable. The cracks behind the brand were no longer just emotional or financial. They were about to become something far darker. And in the next phase of this story, the silence would be broken, not by a post, not by an announcement, but by news that would shock everyone who thought they knew the truth. Because the business wasn't just failing. It was becoming the backdrop to a tragedy no one saw coming. Silence turned into a crime scene. By the time people realized something was seriously wrong, it was already too late. What began as concern quietly shifted into alarm when she stopped responding entirely. Not delayed replies. Not brief check-ins. Nothing at all. For someone who had been consistently present, online, by phone, through work, the silence felt unnatural. Friends tried reaching out. Messages went unread. Calls rang without answers. At first, there were rational explanations. She might be resting. She might need space. She might be overwhelmed. After all, she had been under pressure for weeks. Everyone knew that. But as hours turned into a full day, and then more, unease set in. This wasn't like her. Someone close to her finally decided that waiting wasn't an option anymore. Concern outweighed courtesy. And that decision, made out of fear rather than certainty, would lead to a discovery no one was prepared for. When authorities were alerted and a welfare check was initiated, no one expected what came next. The scene was quiet. Too quiet. Inside, they found her, lifeless. The woman who had dedicated her life to healing others was gone. The news spread fast, but not fast enough to soften the blow. Shock rippled through her community. Clients couldn't believe it. Friends struggled to process it. Social media pages that once celebrated empowerment were suddenly filled with disbelief, confusion, and grief. How? Why? What happened? Authorities confirmed what no one wanted to hear. She was dead. Details were limited at first. Investigators were careful with information, knowing how quickly speculation spreads. But even in the early stages, one thing was clear. This was not a natural death. The case was immediately treated as suspicious. AS police began their investigation. They focused on reconstructing her final days. Who she spoke to, where she went, what pressures she was under, what conflicts may have existed behind closed doors. And very quickly, attention turned inward, toward the people closest to her. Because statistically, when something like this happens, the answers are rarely found far away, that they're usually close, uncomfortably close. Her business partnership became a key area of interest. Investigators examined financial records, communication logs, and recent disputes connected to the self-care program. What they uncovered painted a troubling picture, one of growing tension, unresolved conflict, and emotional strain. Then there was her mother, the woman who had been her partner, her mentor, her family. Publicly, the mother appeared shocked and devastated. She spoke of loss, of grief, of heartbreak. To outsiders, it looked like a woman mourning her child, something no parent should ever have to do. But investigators don't rely on appearances. They rely on facts. As questioning began, inconsistencies started to emerge. Timelines didn't line up perfectly. Certain explanations raised more questions than answers. Small details, ones that might seem insignificant on their own, began to accumulate. And when details pile up, patterns form. Authorities examined communication between them in the days leading up to her death. Messages revealed stress, emotional strain, conversations that suggested conflict rather than harmony. The dream partnership, it seemed, had reached a breaking point. Financial matters were also scrutinized. Money has a way of complicating relationships, and, in this case, it may have done more than complicate them. Investigators looked into disagreements over control, revenue, and ownership within the business. Was there pressure? Was there fear? Was there a motive? These were the questions driving the investigation. As word of her death spread, the narrative shifted. What was once a story about a promising entrepreneur became a full-scale true crime case. Media attention intensified. Online discussions exploded. People who had admired the brand began revisiting old posts, searching for clues hidden in plain sight. And then came the moment that changed everything. Authorities announced that someone close to her was now considered a person of interest. That announcement sent shockwaves through the community, because it meant what many were afraid to say out loud, but couldn't ignore, might actually be true. The idea that a mother could be connected to her daughter's death felt unthinkable. It went against every instinct people have about family, protection, and unconditional love. But investigations don't follow instincts. They follow evidence. As more details emerged, it became clear that this case wasn't about a random act of violence. It wasn't about an unknown intruder or an accident gone wrong. The IT was about relationship dynamics, about power, about control, and possibly about fear of losing it. Those who knew her best struggled to reconcile the woman they loved with the circumstances of her death. Many spoke about her kindness, her patience, her desire to avoid conflict. They questioned how someone so gentle could end up at the center of something so dark. But sometimes it's precisely that gentleness that makes someone vulnerable. Police continued working carefully, piecing together what happened in the final hours. Where arguments may have escalated, what decisions were made, what lines were crossed. And with every new detail, the truth grew heavier. This was no longer just a tragic loss. That IT was a betrayal, one rooted in trust, proximity, and unresolved tension. That as the investigation progressed, one thing became painfully clear. The self-care brand that promised healing had become the setting for a fatal breakdown. The same relationship that was supposed to nurture growth had turned into something destructive. And the most chilling realization of all, the danger didn't come from the outside world. That IT came from within her inner circle. That by the time the public fully understood the direction the case was taking, the image of a perfect mother-daughter partnership had completely collapsed. In its place was a story far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. A story that forced people to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, the people we trust the most are the ones capable of causing the deepest harm. And in the final part of this story, the investigation would move toward answers that would raise difficult questions about motive, accountability, and whether justice could ever truly repair what had been destroyed. Because healing, once and by betrayal, is never the same again. Broke. When justice tries to catch up with loss. By the time the investigation reached its most critical stage, the story had already changed forever. What began as a self-care brand rooted in healing had now become a case defined by suspicion, fractured trust, and unanswered questions. The focus was no longer on what she hoped to build, but on what had gone wrong. and how deeply. Investigators worked carefully. Cases involving family require precision, not assumptions. Every step mattered. Every detail was weighed. Every statement examined. And at the center of it all remained one unavoidable truth. The conflict that surrounded her final days did not come from strangers. It came from inside her closest circle. Authorities continued reconstructing the timeline, hour by hour. They examined movements, communications, financial records, and emotional dynamics. Witness statements painted a picture of a woman under increasing pressure, torn between loyalty and self-preservation. Experts often say that crimes rooted in personal relationships are rarely spontaneous. They build slowly, fueled by unresolved tension, control issues, and fear of loss. In this case, the partnership had become a pressure cooker. The investigation raised difficult questions. Was the business no longer just about wellness, but about power? Did disagreements cross from emotional into dangerous territory? Was there a moment when control felt threatened? Investigators looked closely at motive, not just money, but authority, identity, and control. When family and business collide, the stakes can feel unbearably high. Losing a partnership can feel like losing influence. Losing control can feel like losing everything. And sometimes, fear reacts before reason. As the case unfolded, public perception shifted again. Sympathy remained, but it became complicated. Grief mixed with disbelief. Supporters struggled to reconcile the image of a loving partnership with the realities uncovered by investigators. The self-care messaging, once comforting, now felt haunting in hindsight. Words about peace, posts about healing, messages about alignment. All of it now existed alongside a tragic ending that contradicted everything the brand stood for. For those who followed the case closely, one of the most painful realizations was this. The warning signs had been there, but they were subtle. Emotional withdrawal, growing stress, quiet isolation, the kind of signals that don't scream for help but whisper it. And whispers are easy to miss. As legal processes moved forward, the story became less about spectacle and more about accountability. Investigations aren't just about punishment, they're about truth. About understanding what happened so that it doesn't happen again. But even when justice systems do their work, they can't restore what was lost. They can't bring back a daughter. They can't undo fear. They can't heal betrayal. Friends and clients mourned not just her death, but the future she never got to live. The programs she wanted to build. The people she hoped to help. The peace she sought for others but never fully found herself. Her life became a cautionary tale. One that forces uncomfortable reflection about boundaries, about family dynamics, about mixing love with business without protection, about assuming trust where structure is needed. Because trust without boundaries can become dangerous. In the aftermath, conversations shifted. People spoke openly about the risks of family partnerships, about the importance of contracts, transparency, and emotional safety. About recognizing when something no longer feels right, and listening to that instinct before it's too late. Her story sparked those discussions not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. There were no villains in costumes that no strangers in the shadows, just people, relationships, pressure, and decisions that spiraled out of control. And perhaps that's the most unsettling part. This wasn't a story that felt distant, that it felt possible. It reminded people that danger doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it hides behind familiarity, behind smiles, behind words like family and trust. As time passed, the headlines faded, but the questions remained. Could this have been prevented? If she had walked away sooner, would she still be alive? If someone had intervened, spoken up, pushed harder, would the outcome have changed? Those questions don't have answers. What remains is her legacy, not the brand, not the controversy, but the reminder her life leaves behind. That self-care isn't just about rest and routines, it's about safety, about boundaries, about listening to discomfort even when it comes from places we're taught never to question. Her story ends where it began, with a belief in healing. But this time, the lesson is heavier. Because healing sometimes requires walking away. Sometimes it requires choosing distance over loyalty. Sometimes it requires protecting yourself, even from the people you love most. And if there's one truth this case leaves us with, it's this. The most dangerous betrayals aren't always driven by hate. Sometimes they're driven by fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of losing power. Fear of being left behind. In the end, she paid the ultimate price for trusting that love alone would be enough. And while justice may attempt to close the case, her story remains open, in the hearts of those who remember her, and in the lessons it leaves for anyone who believes that good intentions are always enough. Because sometimes the hardest truth to accept is this: the place we expect to be safest is not always where we are.